Hello, everyone. Welcome to Chess Fun. In this video, I will share the 3 fastest checkmate scenarios, Danish Gambit openings, from games by grandmasters. How exciting it is! Watch the video until the end only on Zuko Chess Fun. Let's dive into the first game between Henry E. Bird and Emanuel Lasker in 1892. Here, Henry E. Bird plays as white and Emanuel Lasker as black. The game starts with pawn to e4, pawn to e5, white pawn to d4, black pawn takes pawn on d4, white pawn to c3, black pawn takes pawn on c3, white refrains from taking the pawn on c3 and plays bishop to c4, black pawn takes pawn on b2, and bishop takes pawn on b2. Danish Gambit accepted. Continuing, queen to g5 attacks the pawn on g2. What do you think is the best move for white here? Henry E. Bird plays knight to f3, attacking the queen and leaving his pawn on g2. Next, black takes pawn on g2 and attacks the rook. The rook moves to g1, counterattacking the queen. Emanuel Lasker plays bishop to b4. Check. The king moves to e2 to avoid the check, and black saves the queen to h3. It's evident that black will win the game since they only lose one pawn here. Now, white's surprising move is bishop takes pawn on f7, check. In the game, the king goes to d8, but let's see what happens if the king takes the bishop. Then, knight to g5, check, and black's queen will be lost. Returning to the game, after king to d8 avoids the check, bishop takes pawn on g7, and here the black rook is trapped. Black's knight goes to e7. White delays capturing the rook, but knight to g5 attacks the queen. Black saves the queen to h4. And next is the winning move for white. You can pause the video to find it. And yes, you're right. Knight to e6 and checkmate. Alright, the second game is between Whiskey and Rosma. This game took place in 1951. Here, Wysocki plays as white and Rossman plays as black. The game starts with pawn to e4, pawn to e5, pawn to d4, black pawn takes pawn on d4, white pawn to c3, black pawn takes pawn on c3, bishop to c4, Danish Gambit, black pawn takes pawn on b2, bishop takes pawn on b2, black pawn to d6, queen to b3, attacking pawn f7 twice. Queen to e7 protects pawn f7 and also attacks pawn e4. Knight to c3 protects pawn a4. Black continues with pawn to c6. Very boldly, white castles long. Let's see. White's pawn defense here is gone. Continuing, black bishop to e6, challenging the bishop. White bishop takes bishop, pawn takes bishop, and knight to f3. Knight to a6, bishop to a3, knight to c5 attacks the queen. White bishop takes knight, pawn takes bishop, and white plays knight to b5. Let's see. If pawn takes knight,
The queen?
takes pawn on b5, check. The queen can't block the check because file d is guarded by the rook. So, the king must move to f8, and rook to d7, black's queen will be lost. Returning to the game, here black doesn't capture the knight with a pawn, but plays rook to d8, challenging the rook. White continues with rook takes rook, check. Here, black doesn't capture the rook with the queen because the queen is guarding pawn e6, so black's king takes the rook. White saves the knight to d6, with the idea that if the queen takes knight d6, then rook to d1 pins the queen. So, black continues with pawn to b6, and white knight to e5, threatening check and attacking the queen. With knight taking pawn on c6, black's king goes to c7, protecting pawn c6, and attacking knight d6. Knight to f7, attacking the rook. Knight to h6. Here, white doesn't capture the rook with the knight, but plays queen to a4, attacking both pawns. Black accepts the knight's sacrifice. Black's knight takes knight. Queen takes pawn on a7. Check. Now, Black's king has 3 squares to move. In the game here, the king goes to c8. But what if the king goes to d8? Then, knight takes pawn on c6. Check. And the queen will be lost. Returning again, what if Black's king goes to d6? Then, knight to c4, checkmate. Back to the game. After king to c8, queen to a8, check. The king can only go back to c7. The queen takes pawn on c6, check. Black's king goes to b8. In the next move, Black surrenders, which is knight to d7. Here, Black surrenders. Black can sacrifice the queen by taking the knight, but White is still significantly ahead since they still have 1 rook. If we avoid check, then the only choice is king to a7, followed by queen taking pawn on b6, check. Forced move, king to a8, and queen to a6, checkmate. And finally, the game between Alekhine and Suppico that took place in 1941. Here, Alekhine played with the white pieces and Suppico with the black pieces. The game began with pawn to e4, pawn to e5, pawn to d4, capturing the pawn on d4, then pawn to c3, initiating the Danish Gambit. Black's pawn captured on c3, and here White captured Black's pawn on c3 with the knight. Black continued with bishop to b4, pinning the knight, then bishop to c4. Black's queen moved to e7, eyeing to capture the pawn on e4. White continued with knight to e2, allowing the queen to capture the pawn on e4 to open the e-file. Instead of capturing the pawn, Black moved the knight to f6, attacking the pawn on e4 twice. White castled kingside, and Black followed suit. The bishop moved to g5, pinning the knight. The queen moved to e5, releasing the pin. The bishop captured the knight, and the queen recaptured the bishop. The knight moved to d5, attacking both the queen and the bishop. The queen moved to d6, protecting the bishop. The pawn moved to e5, still attacking the queen. If the queen captures the pawn, then the knight will capture the bishop. Black continued with the queen to c5, attacking the bishop. White moved the rook to c1, protecting the bishop indirectly. Black's queen moved to a5, and the pawn to a3 attacked the bishop. Let's take a look at the escape route for the bishop here. The square e7 is guarded by the knight, and the square d6 is guarded by the pawn. If the bishop retreats to c5, then the pawn will advance to b4, attacking both the queen and the bishop. If the bishop retreats to d2, then it's the same situation with the pawn moving to b4, attacking the queen, and the bishop will be lost. Let's go back to the game. Here, Black's bishop captured the pawn on a3, and the pawn recaptured the bishop. Black's pawn advanced to c6, attacking the knight. The knight moved to e7, giving a check. The king was forced to move to h8. The queen moved to d6, indirectly attacking the rook on f8. The queen retreated to d8, protecting the rook. The knight moved to d4, and the pawn to b6, opening the path for the bishop. The rook moved to c3, and the pawn to c5 attacked the knight. The knight moved to f5, and Black's bishop moved to a6, challenging the bishop. And the winning move for White begins from here. Do you know it? Yes, the queen to g6, and in this position, Black resigned. Let's see the threat here with the queen capturing the pawn on g7, leading to checkmate. So, Black's move here is to move the rook to g8, protecting the pawn on g7. If Black wants to remove the queen, the options are either the pawn on f7 capturing the queen or the pawn on g7 capturing the queen. Let's try first what if the pawn on f7 captures the queen. Then the knight captures the pawn on g6, giving check. We see that the square g8 is guarded by the bishop, so black is forced to capture the knight with the pawn. The rook moves to h3, giving check. The king cannot move, so black's queen moves to h4, blocking the check, and the rook captures the queen. Checkmate. Alright, let's go back to this position. What if here black's pawn on h7 captures the queen? Then the rook moves to h3. Checkmate. Alright, let's go back to this position again, and finally, what if here black's rook moves to g8, protecting the pawn on g7 from the threat of the queen capturing the pawn on g7? But unfortunately, because the queen captures the pawn on h7, check. Black's move is forced to capture the queen. The rook moves to h3, giving checkmate. Alright, that's it. That's the beautiful checkmate from the Danish Gambit opening. Hopefully, the video is useful. Don't forget to support this channel by pressing the subscribe and like buttons for the video. Stay tuned for other interesting videos, and until next time.